It was supposed to be a simple day of cleaning, a task Eleanor had put off for far too long. The attic was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb that swayed slightly with every shift in the old house's foundation. Dust floated lazily in the beams of light, and the air smelled of cedarwood, aged paper, and time. It was one of those scents that pulled you backward into memories you hadn't thought about in years. For Eleanor, those memories were as fragile as the cardboard boxes stacked in every corner. She was 72 now, and since her husband Frank had passed away 5 years ago, her days had been quieter than she'd ever imagined. No one tells you how loud silence can be. It had taken her weeks to work up the energy to come up here. "Just clean it out, Ellie," she muttered to herself, hands on her hips, "before Julia has to do it after you're gone." She hated thinking that way, but it was true. Her only daughter, Julia, had her own life now, 2 kids, and barely any time to visit, let alone clean out an old attic. Eleanor reached for the first box, labeled photo albums, in her own handwriting from years ago. The ink had faded, just like everything else. Inside were stacks of old Polaroids, wedding snapshots, and school portraits of Julia through the years. She smiled softly as she ran her fingers over one of the photos, a picture of her and Frank on their honeymoon in 1971. Young. So impossibly young. Her smile faded. It hurt to remember sometimes. Grief wasn't linear. It didn't lessen with time. It just hid better. Shaking her head, she returned the photo to the box and moved to the next. Her hands worked slowly, placing old books into keep and donate piles until her fingers brushed against something familiar. It wasn't paper or cardboard. It was soft, warm. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Her hands gripped the fabric, pulling it out slowly, her heart already knowing what it was before her eyes confirmed it. The tissue paper crinkled like autumn leaves as she unwrapped it, revealing soft ivory silk with delicate lace sleeves. Her wedding dress. Her heart gave a jolt so sharp that she had to steady herself on the side of an old trunk. It had been over 50 years since she had last seen it, let alone touched it. For a moment, she just stood there, unable to breathe, her fingers tracing the lace detailing along the neckline. Her mother had sewn that lace herself. Every stitch had been done with love, patience, and an attention to detail that Eleanor had never fully appreciated at the time. She remembered the day her mother presented it to her, holding it up with pride like she'd crafted it from stardust itself. "For my beautiful girl," her mother had said, brushing Eleanor's cheek with a tenderness she rarely showed. "You'll be the most beautiful bride anyone has ever seen." Eleanor's eyes misted over at the memory. She held the dress up to her chest, breathing in its scent. It smelled faintly of lavender, the same lavender sachets her mother always tucked into drawers and closets. Her heart twisted. Her mother had passed away over 20 years ago. And Frank, well, Frank was gone too. But here she was, holding the proof of a moment in time when everything had seemed so full of promise. Slowly, she moved toward the small attic window where the light was better. The sun filtered through the cloudy glass, catching on the dress's lace trim like tiny stars. That's when she saw it. At first, she thought it was just a fold in the fabric. But when she smoothed it out, she noticed it didn't lay flat. Her fingers moved over the hem of the dress, and there it was again, a small bulge, as if something had been sewn inside. Her brow furrowed. Her fingers traced the bump, confusion tightening in her chest. "What on earth?" she muttered, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Her heart began to pound, not in fear, but in that strange way your heart races when you realize something isn't quite right. Her mind spun with questions. Had the seam come undone? Was it just an old thread that had balled up inside the fabric? No, it felt too solid for that. Her breathing quickened. She set the dress down carefully on a nearby box and hurried downstairs, gripping the banister as she descended faster than she should have. Her knees didn't like stairs anymore, but she didn't care. Something about this moment felt important. Her fingers fumbled through her sewing kit drawer until she found a small pair of scissors. Returning to the attic, she sat on the floor, cross-legged like she hadn't done since she was a young mother sewing Halloween costumes for Julia. Her hands trembled as she picked up the dress and turned it over in her lap. Easy now, she told herself, taking slow, measured breaths. She carefully slipped the scissor blade beneath the edge of the hem where the bulge was. She snipped a few threads and stopped. Her heart pounded in her ears, a soft thudding drumbeat of anticipation and anxiety. Another snip, then another. She held her breath as the fabric separated. Slowly, something slid out and landed in her lap. A small, folded slip of paper, yellowed with age. Her mouth went dry. She stared at it, her eyes wide, her breath frozen in her lungs. It wasn't what she had expected. Not a price tag or a seamstress's note. No, this was something different. Something personal. Her fingers moved slowly, afraid of what she might find. Carefully, she unfolded the paper. It had been folded twice, so neatly, as if someone had wanted it to stay hidden. When the paper lay flat, she could see the handwriting immediately. It was familiar. The kind of familiar that sends chills down your spine. Her mother's handwriting. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she let out a soft, "Oh God." Her mother had beautiful penmanship, tight, elegant cursive that was always perfectly slanted to the right. And now here it was on this little slip of paper staring back at her like a ghost. The message was simple, but it felt like a punch to the chest. It read, "Eleanor, my sweet girl, you deserve the truth. This marriage will not bring you happiness. I know something you don't." Mother. Her whole body went cold. Her fingers gripped the note so tightly she feared she might tear it. Her heart pounded in her chest, louder than ever before. Her mother had written this before her wedding. Why hadn't she said anything to her face? Why had she sewn it into the dress, where Eleanor wouldn't find it until now? She felt a rush of anger at her mother, then guilt for feeling that way. Her eyes scanned the note again, searching for something, anything that might explain it. This marriage will not bring you happiness. Her breath came in short gasps. She shook her head slowly, tears already burning in her eyes. Her mother had always been stubborn, always had opinions about Frank. But Eleanor had been so sure, so determined to marry him. She loved him. At least, she thought she had. Her mother had been kind but firm on her wedding day, offering quiet smiles but little else. Eleanor had always assumed it was the usual sadness of a mother letting go of her daughter. But this changed everything. What did she know? Eleanor's mind spun in circles. Had her mother seen something in Frank that she'd missed? Had she known about the nights Eleanor cried after arguments about money or his late nights at work? The doubts she'd buried for decades came roaring back to the surface like old ghosts that had been waiting for this very moment. She thought of every silence her mother had kept, every pause before speaking, every warning disguised as advice. Her lips trembled, and she let out a shaky laugh that turned into a sob. "You knew, didn't you?" she said aloud, as if her mother might hear her from wherever she was. Her tears fell freely now, hot on her cheeks. All those years thinking she had been in control, thinking she had chosen this life with full agency. But her mother had known something she hadn't been ready to face. The note slipped from her hand, floating softly to the ground like a feather. It lay there, face up, its words staring back at her as if daring her to look away. But she couldn't. The truth had a way of pulling you in, even when you weren't ready. Eleanor sat in the middle of her attic floor, surrounded by half-open boxes, old photo albums, and forgotten trinkets that once seemed so important. But none of it mattered now. The only thing that mattered was the tiny, crumpled note lying at her feet like a discarded leaf. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, each syllable landing like a hammer on fragile glass. This marriage will not bring you happiness. I know something you don't. Her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. She pressed her hands to her face, her fingers trembling against her cheeks. For a moment, she didn't know if she wanted to cry, scream, or laugh at the absurdity of it all. Her mother had always been blunt, but this wasn't blunt. It was a wound that had been hiding in plain sight for over 50 years. And now, with Frank gone, she would never get the chance to confront him about it. Her heart ached with confusion. She thought she had made peace with her past, with Frank's flaws, and with the life they'd built together. It wasn't perfect, but it had been theirs. At least, that's what she believed. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater, her gaze locked on the note as if it might change if she looked long enough. "Why didn't you just tell me, Mama?" she whispered aloud, her voice cracking under the weight of it all. Her mother had never been one for gentle honesty. If she had something to say, she said it. So why had she hidden this? Why had she sewn it into a place she knew Eleanor wouldn't find until it was far too late? Her mind reeled with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Did Frank do something? She wondered. Did Mama see something in him that I didn't? Her thoughts flickered to those early years of marriage, the ones where she had to learn how to pick her battles. Frank had been charming in public, always the life of the party, but behind closed doors, he could be sharp with his words. He never hit her. No, it wasn't that. But sometimes the way he spoke to her left bruises that didn't show. There had been nights she cried in the bathroom after an argument, muffling her sobs with a towel so Julia wouldn't hear. Was that what Mama saw? She thought bitterly. Is that what she meant by, "This marriage will not bring you happiness"? But that couldn't be it, could it? She knew plenty of people who had rough patches in marriage. It wasn't like Eleanor had been miserable every day. There were good times, too. Family trips to the beach, watching Julia grow up, and the quiet nights where she and Frank sat side by side on the porch, sipping iced tea as the crickets sang in the background. She had loved him. She had been sure of it. Hadn't she? Her hands pressed against her chest, feeling her heart thudding as if it, too, was struggling to make sense of it all. Her mind wandered back to her mother. Her mother, who had never fully liked Frank but had accepted him, or so Eleanor had thought. She remembered the cool look in her mother's eyes as she walked down the aisle that day in 1971. At the time, she mistaken it for motherly sadness, that quiet grief parents feel when they realize their child is growing up. But now, with a note in her hand, that look felt different. Was it sadness? Or was it disapproval? Eleanor's stomach churned with the realization that maybe she'd never really known her mother at all. How could she have missed it? The rain outside had picked up, tapping steadily on the attic window. She closed her eyes and leaned her head back against an old box, letting the cool wood press against her scalp. Her mind was too full, and every memory she had of her mother and Frank now felt suspect. She started to piece together moments that had never seemed important before. The Christmas when her mother had refused to sit next to Frank at the dinner table. The way she brushed off his stories as if they were just noise. And that one time, just days before the wedding, when her mother had pulled her aside and said, "Are you sure, Ellie? Are you really sure?" Eleanor had laughed at her then. She had been so young, so full of certainty. "Of course, I'm sure, Mama," she'd said, her voice bright with the glow of a woman on the brink of something new. "Frank is everything I want." Her mother had given her a long, quiet stare before nodding. "All right," she'd said softly. "All right, then." Eleanor hadn't realized it at the time, but that moment had been her mother letting go, letting her make her own mistakes. But why? Why didn't she tell me the truth? She sat forward, her hands gripping her knees, eyes locked on the little slip of paper like it was a living thing. "You deserve the truth." The words stung her more than anything else. She had spent her entire adult life believing she had chosen this life on her own terms. She'd been proud of that. Eleanor wasn't some naive girl who didn't know the world. She'd been smart, thoughtful, and deliberate with her choices. Or so she had thought. But now that confidence felt like a lie. Her mother had seen something, known something, and rather than tell her, she buried it in a hemline. Her eyes darted back to the note. "I know something you don't." The words felt heavier now. This wasn't just about her marriage. It was about her. It was about something she'd been blind to for decades. Her breathing quickened, her chest tight with panic. She stood suddenly, nearly knocking over a stack of boxes. She had to move. She had to think. She paced the attic, her arms crossed tightly over her chest like she could shield herself from the growing storm inside. "What did you know, Mama?" she hissed, her voice sharper this time, her tone edged with anger. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Her gaze flicked to the dress again. That stupid, beautiful dress. She had worn it with pride. She had spun around in front of the mirror like a princess, laughing as her father wiped away tears. She remembered the feeling of her mother's hands on her shoulders, steadying her, smoothing down the lace. "You look perfect," her mother had said. Perfect. And yet, as Eleanor looked at the dress now, she felt anything but perfect. She felt like a fool. Her mind spun with possibilities. Was it a secret about Frank? Had her mother known about his late nights at work, the unexplained expenses, or the woman Eleanor had once seen him talking to outside of a cafe? No, she told herself. It's too easy to blame him. Frank had his flaws, but he wasn't a monster. If her mother had seen something darker in him, she would have warned Eleanor outright. Wouldn't she? Her heart ached with doubt. The truth felt like a shadow creeping closer with every passing second. But then a new thought hit her, a deeper, colder thought that made her shudder. What if it wasn't about Frank? Her breathing stilled. Her hands went cold. What if the note wasn't about him at all? Her eyes darted back to the words on the paper, scanning them like they were a riddle she had to solve. This marriage will not bring you happiness. Not he won't bring you happiness. Not Frank. The marriage. Her knees gave out, and she sat on the floor again, her head in her hands. Her mind flashed through moments she hadn't thought about in years. The times she had stayed quiet when she should have spoken up. The times she had put her dreams aside for someone else's needs. Her mother had seen it, hadn't she? The girl who was so desperate to be loved that she gave up pieces of herself to keep it. The Eleanor who smoothed things over, made things easier, played the good wife even when it hurt. Her mother had seen it all, but Eleanor hadn't. Not until now. Her throat tightened as a sob escaped her lips. She buried her face in her hands, letting herself cry like she hadn't cried in years. Not for Frank. Not for her mother. For herself. For the girl who had wanted to believe love was enough. For the woman who had lived an entire life chasing a version of happiness that wasn't even hers. The note was right. Her mother had known something she didn't. And now, at 72 years old, she finally understood it. Eleanor didn't know how long she sat there. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. The rain outside had gone from a gentle patter to a steady downpour, filling the attic with the soft hum of falling water. She wiped her face with her sleeve, but the tears kept coming in quiet, uncontrollable streams. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, the weight of the note pressing down on her chest like a stone. Her eyes darted to the little paper again. This marriage will not bring you happiness. I know something you don't. Her mother's words played on repeat, like an old record with a broken groove. Her hands trembled as she reached for the note again. This time, she examined it slowly, tilting it back and forth in the pale attic light. It wasn't just the words that haunted her. It was the intent behind them. Her mother hadn't warned her directly. No, she'd hidden the message in a hemline, tucked it away like a secret that Eleanor wasn't meant to find. Why? Her teeth clenched as a fresh wave of anger surged through her. Why wouldn't you just tell me, Mama? She muttered under her breath, her voice hoarse and raw. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to make sense of it all. But the attic was just the attic. Boxes, dust, old things that no longer mattered. She let out a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. But there was no steadying herself. Her mind was spinning with memories she hadn't thought about in years. Her wedding day, the reception, the honeymoon. She had been so happy, hadn't she? Or had she just convinced herself she was happy? Her breath hitched at that thought, her eyes squeezing shut. Don't do this, Eleanor. Her mind tried to push it away, but the thought had already taken root. It was like a crack in a dam, and now the water was rushing in. Had she been happy? She thought about the night of her wedding. She had been so nervous, standing in front of that big old mirror in the bridal suite. Her mother had come in, her face serious, her hands folded in front of her like she was bracing herself. Eleanor had been brushing her hair, still glowing from the adrenaline of the ceremony. I'm so proud of you, Ellie, her mother had said, but there had been something in her voice, something Eleanor didn't catch back then but could hear clearly now. Thanks, Mama, Eleanor had replied, spinning to face her. I just can't believe I'm married. It doesn't feel real yet. Her mother's eyes had softened, but there was a sadness there too. Eleanor remembered it now, and it made her chest ache. Was she trying to tell me then? Eleanor's heart pounded harder. Her fingers pressed against her temples as she let out a shaky breath. She hadn't seen it then, but she saw it now. Her mother had known. Her mind flashed her honeymoon with Frank. They had gone to New Orleans, a city full of jazz music and moonlit walks by the river. She had expected it to be magical. And at first, it was. They had strolled hand in hand through the French Quarter, eating beignets and laughing at street performers. But on the third night, they had their first fight. It wasn't a big fight, just a small disagreement over dinner plans. But it was the way he'd spoken to her, the sharp edge in his voice when he said, "You're being ridiculous, Eleanor. Just pick something." It wasn't the words. It was the way he said it, like she was a child who didn't know her own mind. It had stung, but she let it go. It's just a bad mood, she had told herself. Everyone has bad moods. But the fights had continued. Small, insignificant fights that she brushed aside because that's what marriage was, right? No one's happy all the time, she had told herself. Her mother's warning echoed louder now. This marriage will not bring you happiness. Eleanor felt like she was suffocating under the weight of it all. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, the steady thrum matching the wild beat of her heart. Her fingers gripped the notes so tightly that the edges crumpled. She set it aside before she ripped it in half, then pressed her palms flat against the attic floor, grounding herself in its rough, cool surface. She felt like she was falling, like her world had shifted beneath her feet. Had it all been a lie? Her gaze shifted back to the wedding dress, still draped across a stack of boxes. Her eyes narrowed at it like it had betrayed her too. She hated it suddenly. Hated the way it still looked so beautiful, so pristine, like it was mocking her for believing in fairy tales. She stood abruptly, wiping her face with both hands. "All right," she muttered, her voice low and firm. "All right, Eleanor. Thank." She paced the attic, her arms folded tightly over her chest. The mama knew something. What was it? Her mind went back to the weeks leading up to the wedding. Her mother had been distant, hadn't she? Not cold, but distracted. There had been quiet looks between her and Eleanor's father, looks that had felt too long, too knowing. At the time, Eleanor had thought it was just nerves, but now she wasn't so sure. Her pacing slowed. What if it wasn't about Frank? Her chest tightened, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. What if it wasn't about him at all? She turned to look at the dress again. Her heart pounded in her ears as she moved toward it. Slowly she crouched down, her fingers running over the lace sleeves, the floral embroidery her mother had sewn with so much care. Her eyes flickered with realization. No, her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers gripped the sleeve, tugging it, searching for another bulge, another secret. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. If she hid one note, could she have hidden another? Her hands moved frantically now, feeling along every seam of the dress, every fold and pleat. Her eyes darted back and forth as her fingers searched for any sign of something hidden. Please, please, let there be something else. Give me something. But there was nothing. Just the softness of fabric, the smooth glide of silk against her fingertips. Her heart sank. Why would she only leave one message? It didn't make sense. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, biting down on her bottom lip. Then she remembered. The train. The dress had a long, flowing train, one her mother had insisted on, even though Eleanor thought it was too much. Every bride should have a train, Ellie, her mother had said, her voice firm but playful. It's tradition. Eleanor's eyes flew open. The train. Her hands darted to the back of the dress, fingers working quickly now, more urgently than before. She felt along the edge of the train, pressing firmly as she moved inch by inch. Her breathing was shallow, her chest tight with anticipation. Her fingers brushed against something hard. Her heart leapt. There. Her fingers pressed into it, tracing the small outline of something hidden in the seam. This time, she didn't hesitate. She ran for the scissors. Her heart thudded in her chest like a drumbeat as she snipped the threads, one by one, each cut sending a rush of adrenaline through her veins. Finally, the fabric split, and something small and metallic tumbled into her hand. It was cold, smooth, a locket. A tiny heart-shaped locket on a gold chain. Her hand shook as she turned it over, eyes wide with disbelief. This can't be real. She searched for a clasp, her fingers fumbling as she tried to open it. It wouldn't budge at first. Her heart pounded harder. Her fingers were slick with sweat. Finally, it clicked open with a soft snap. Inside was a small black and white photo of a man she didn't recognize. His face was unfamiliar, strong jawline, dark eyes, and a slight smile that felt too familiar. Her breath caught in her chest, and her fingers flew to her mouth. Beneath the photo, there was another slip of paper. Smaller this time, barely the size of a matchbook. Her fingers pulled it free. The handwriting was once again her mother's. His name was Henry. He was my love before your father. I never stopped thinking about him. Eleanor's knees buckled. She dropped to the floor, clutching the locket to her chest as if it might disappear. Henry. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible over the sound of the rain. Her mother had been in love with someone else, and she never told anyone. Eleanor sat on the attic floor, cradling the locket in her hands like it was something fragile and sacred. Her eyes stared down at the small, weathered photo of the man named Henry, her heart pounding with strange, hollow ache. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her lips pressed together so tightly they ached. Her mother had been in love with another man, not her father. Henry. Her mind struggled to make sense of it. This was her mother, the woman who had scolded her for staying out too late in high school, The woman who made her tomato soup when she was sick. The woman who always seemed so sure of everything, always so grounded. But this felt like discovering a crack running down the center of a stone she'd thought was unbreakable. Mama had a secret love? Eleanor's fingers brushed over the tiny locket, tracing the smooth edges as if touching it would make the answers clearer. It didn't. If anything, it made everything feel more tangled. Her eyes flickered to the note. She picked it up with her free hand, her gaze locked on those words. His name was Henry. He was my love before your father. I never stopped thinking about him. Eleanor read it over and over, as if she might discover a hidden meaning, a second message lying beneath the first. But it was clear. Too clear. Her mother had loved someone else before she married Eleanor's father. But why had she hidden it? Why didn't she tell me? Her breath hitched in her chest. The weight of it was unbearable. Slowly, she leaned back against the old cedar trunk, her eyes staring blankly at the slanted attic ceiling above her. Her mind was a mess of questions, none of which had answers. Was her mother forced to marry her father? Did her father know? Had he known the whole time that she had loved another man? Eleanor's fingers curled tightly around the locket until she felt the hard press of it against her palm. Why, Mama? Her mother had always told her to live honestly, to be truthful, even when it was hard. Yet here was a lie so big, so buried, that Eleanor could barely breathe around it. The faces of her parents filled her mind, flickering like old film footage. Her father, stoic and dependable, the man who taught her how to ride a bike and never missed a parent-teacher conference. Her mother, with her watchful eyes and sharp wit, always the first to offer advice, whether Eleanor wanted it or not. Together, they had seemed solid. No, not just solid, unbreakable. But now, with this revelation hanging in the air, every memory felt brittle, like old porcelain that could crack under the slightest pressure. Her eyes darted to the locket again. Henry. She had never heard that name before. Not once. Her parents had always been John and Margaret, the picture-perfect couple. At least, that's what she'd always believed. But now she could see it clearly. The quiet moments, the pauses in their conversations, the long sighs her mother would let out late at night after washing the dishes. Had she been thinking about Henry? Her chest tightened at the thought. The more she thought about it, the more questions bloomed like weeds in her mind. When did she meet him? How long did they love each other? Why didn't they end up together? Eleanor's hands pressed against her face, her fingers digging into her cheeks, as if she could press the questions out of her mind. Did you settle, Mama? Did you settle for Dad because Henry wasn't an option? Her throat burned. Her eyes squeezed shut as she leaned forward, folding herself into her knees like a child hiding from the world. I did the same thing, didn't I? The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had settled too. She had married Frank because it felt like the right thing to do. Because love wasn't supposed to be fireworks, was it? It was supposed to be steady, stable. She had convinced herself of that every time he'd brushed off her feelings, every time he made her feel small. She had told herself it was normal, that it was just marriage. But Mama knew. Eleanor felt the weight of all of it pressing on her at once, her mother's hidden love, her own compromises, and the aching truth that they had both done it to themselves. Her breathing grew shallow, panic rising in her chest. She pushed herself up from the floor, her legs unsteady like she was learning to walk for the first time. She gripped the edge of the old cedar trunk to steady herself. I need air. I can't stay here. Her legs moved before her mind had fully caught up. Down the creaking stairs, through the narrow hallway, and into the living room. Her breaths were short and quick. Her chest felt like it might explode. The rain battered against the window, the world outside a blur of gray and silver streaks. She unlocked the front door, stepped outside onto the porch, and let the cool rain-scented air wash over her. She leaned against the porch railing, breathing in deep, gulping breaths of air like she'd been drowning inside. Her eyes scanned the street, empty and wet, the world washed clean by the rain. She stared at it for a long moment, her fingers still clutching the locket so tightly that the edges bit into her palm. The rain wasn't heavy enough to drench her, just light enough to chill her skin. But she didn't care. Her heart was too full of noise, and the quiet world outside felt like the only place she could think. She turned the locket over in her hands, her eyes narrowing at the old, worn metal. Henry. Who was he? Did he love her mother as deeply as her mother had loved him? Or was he just a passing flame that her mother had built into something bigger in her mind? Eleanor's breath fogged in front of her as she exhaled slowly. Her thumb pressed the locket open again, revealing the man's face. She stared at him for a long time, taking in every detail. The sharp line of his jaw, the softness in his eyes. He didn't look like a flame to her. He looked steady. Her mind suddenly flicked to a box of old letters her mother had kept in the hall closet. Eleanor had never read them, assuming they were just correspondence with old friends or relatives. But now something gnawed at her gut. Were they from him? Were they from Henry? Her feet moved before she realized what she was doing. She left the porch, walked back inside, and moved with purpose. Her fingers yanked open the closet door, and there it was, the old shoebox her mother had kept on the top shelf. Eleanor pulled it down, her arms straining under its weight, and carried it to the kitchen table. Her hands hovered over the lid, her heart pounding in her ears. She hesitated for a moment, her mind flashing with guilt. This isn't mine to see, she thought. But then her eyes darted to the locket, to the words on the slip of paper. You deserve the truth. With a firm resolve, she lifted the lid. The smell of old paper and aged ink filled her nose. Her eyes scanned the contents, stacks of envelopes, all carefully tied together with faded ribbons. Her fingers moved through them, her breath catching every time she saw her mother's handwriting. Then she saw it. A letter with no return address. Her fingers shook as she picked it up. She flipped it over, opened the worn envelope, and pulled out the letter inside. Her eyes scanned the first few words, and her heart stopped. My dearest Margaret, I dreamed of you again last night. I keep telling myself that if I see you in my dreams, maybe I haven't truly lost you. Maybe somehow in another life, we're still dancing under that old oak tree. Her heart slammed against her chest, her breathing sharp and shallow. She flipped to the bottom of the page, searching for a name. And there it was, written in ink so old it had started to fade. Henry. Her knees buckled, and she slumped into the chair behind her, clutching the letter with both hands like it might disappear. It's him. It wasn't a name. It wasn't a mystery anymore. He was real. He wasn't just a memory or a fleeting love from her mother's past. He was real, and he had never stopped loving her. Tears streamed down her face as she sat at the table, the letter open before her. Her heart ached in a way it hadn't in years. Not grief, not sadness, something deeper, regret. Her mother had lived her entire life with this ache in her chest. Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her breath coming in sharp, unsteady gasps. She thought of the note in the wedding dress, the locket, and now this letter. Her mother had hidden all of it away, but for what? Her eyes flicked to the words on the page. In another life, we're still dancing. The letter lay flat on the kitchen table, its edges curling slightly from age. Eleanor's eyes traced the words over and over again, letting them sink in like ink soaking into fabric. In another life, we're still dancing under that old oak tree. Her breath hitched in her chest, a soft, broken gasp she couldn't control. She'd never known her mother to be a romantic. Margaret had always been practical, blunt, firm, and quick to brush off sentimentality. But this letter, these words were something else entirely. They weren't practical. They weren't blunt. They were raw, deep, vulnerable. Her fingers hovered over Henry's name at the bottom of the letter, lightly brushing the faded ink as if touching it might bring him back. How could you love someone so much and never speak of them? Her chest ached at the thought. She glanced at the bundle of letters still tied with ribbons in a shoebox. Were they all from Henry? Her heart thudded in her chest like a drumbeat. She reached for the stack, her hands working quickly to untie the ribbon, her fingers trembling with anticipation. The ribbon slipped free, and the letters spilled onto the table like a flood of forgotten words. She picked up one at random, opened it with care, and began to read. Margaret, I can still see you standing on the porch that summer, your dress swaying in the breeze. I swear I could have watched you for hours. I wonder sometimes if you think of me the way I think of you. I hope you do. If not, I suppose that's something I'll have to carry alone. But I'll carry it gladly if it means I can keep you with me, even in my thoughts. Always. Henry. Her hand shook as she lowered the letter. It wasn't just one letter. It was a love story. Letter after letter, page after page, Henry poured himself into the paper, filling it with memories, dreams, and longings Eleanor had never known existed. Each letter felt like a small window into a world she had never been allowed to see, a world her mother had kept hidden. It was beautiful, but it was also heartbreaking. She placed the letter aside and reached for another. Margaret, I heard from Tommy that you're engaged now. I won't lie, it broke me to hear it. I don't blame you, though. I know how life works. People move on, and sometimes love isn't enough to keep them in one place. But still, I have to ask, did you ever love me the way I loved you? Even if it was just for a moment, please tell me I wasn't alone in it. Yours, Henry. Tears welled in her eyes. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, trying to muffle the sound of her sobs. She could picture him so clearly, a young man, heartbroken, alone at his kitchen table, pen in hand, trying to put words to the kind of pain you can't fully explain. She glanced toward the kitchen window, her gaze lost in the rain-streaked glass. Did she love him? Eleanor wondered. Her mother had never spoken of a Henry. She had never once mentioned his name. It was always John, her father, the man she'd built her life with. Her fingers hovered over the next letter, but pulled away. Her chest was too tight. Her breathing felt shallow. She leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling as if the answer might be written up there. Why didn't you tell me, Mama? Why didn't you tell anyone? Her eyes squeezed shut, tears slipping down her face. It wasn't just about Henry. It was about her mother. Her mother. The woman she had idolized as strong, steady, unshakable. But now I see you, Mama. She saw her as a person. Not just Mama, but Margaret, a woman who had dreams, heartbreaks, and secrets she never shared. A woman who had to choose between love and stability, passion and security. Eleanor thought back to her own life. She had done the same thing, hadn't she? She had chosen Frank for the same reasons. He was safe. He was the kind of man who made sense. But was he the man who made her heart ache with love the way Henry's letters ached with longing? No, she realized. No, he wasn't. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table as the truth settled deep into her bones. She had repeated her mother's life, step for step, choice for choice. They had both chosen the right man over the right love. Eleanor felt like she was drowning in the weight of it. She had spent her whole life believing she was making the best choices, But now, sitting here with these letters, she saw it differently. She saw her own life in a new light, as if she'd been watching a play from backstage, only to realize she'd misunderstood the whole plot. Her eyes darted to the locket still in her hand. She opened it again, staring at Henry's face. She stared for so long that his features became familiar as her father's had been. The ache in her heart shifted. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was regret. Not just for herself, but for her mother too. She carried this love her whole life. Carried it quietly, gracefully, and without complaint. Eleanor could feel the weight of that choice pressing down on her now, like it had been handed from mother to daughter without either of them realizing it. Her mind flashed back to her mother's last days. Her frail frame in the hospital bed, her hands thinner than they'd ever been, her voice so faint it was almost a whisper. "Did you think of him, Mama? Did you think of Henry when you were dying?" Eleanor gripped the edge of the table, her nails digging into the wood. "Did you wonder if he was waiting for you on the other side?" Her breath came out as a slow, shaky exhale. She pushed the stack of letters away from her, leaning forward to press her forehead against the cool surface of the kitchen table. Her tears dripped onto the wood, little dark spots that quickly soaked in. The realization was unbearable. She saw her mother differently now. Not as a figure of wisdom, not as a perfect mother, but as a woman who had lived her life with a wound no one could see. She hadn't been unbreakable. She had just been quiet about it. Eleanor stayed like that for a long time, her head resting on the table, the storm outside finally starting to quiet. Her breathing slowed, her heart still raw, but calmer now. Her fingers slid toward the letters again. She picked up one more, unfolded it slowly, letting the paper open in her lap. "Margaret, I saw you today. You didn't see me, but I saw you. You were holding a little girl's hand. Your daughter, I'm guessing. She looked like you, same eyes, same way of tilting her head like she's listening to the world instead of just hearing it. I told myself I wouldn't write you anymore, but I had to. I just wanted you to know that I'm happy for you. Even if it wasn't me who got to stand by your side, I'm happy you found someone who did. Love her well, Margaret. Teach her everything, you know. Teach her to follow her heart. Because if you don't, she'll end up like us, always wondering about the life that could have been." Henry. Her breath left her in a sharp, broken gasp. Julia, her daughter. Henry had seen her and Julia together. He saw me, she thought. She could feel her pulse pounding at her ears as she read the letter again, her eyes locked on that one line. Teach her to follow her heart. Her body went still. Her fingers shook as she set the letter down. Her mother hadn't taught her that. She had taught her to be practical, to be smart, to be safe. But Henry had wanted her to know something else. Her breath came in slow, ragged bursts. Her gaze lifted toward the window, watching the rain trail down the glass like tears on a cheek. It's not too late, she thought suddenly. Her eyes blinked rapidly as she sat up straighter, her heart pounding again, but this time for a different reason. It's not too late. Eleanor glanced at the letters, the locket, and the wedding dress still draped over the boxes in the attic. Her mother had lived quietly with her regret. But Eleanor still had time. Her hands gripped the locket, feeling the cool weight of it in her palm. She had carried her mother's choices long enough. Her fingers closed around the locket, her gaze fierce now. Her chest rose and fell with deep, steady breaths. It's not too late. She wiped her eyes one last time, stood slowly from the chair, and whispered to herself, "I hear you, Mama. I hear you now." Eleanor sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the storm had passed. The rain had stopped, but the world outside still shimmered with that soft, wet glow that only comes after a storm. Drops of water hung from the edge of the porch roof, each one catching the light before falling in perfect, steady rhythm. The soft plink, plink, plink echoed in her ears like the ticking of a clock. Time. It was always ticking, wasn't it? Time to grow up. Time to marry. Time to raise a family. Time to grieve. Time to let go. Her eyes stayed fixed on the wedding dress draped over the banister at the bottom of the stairs. It hung there like a ghost, soft ivory lace catching the warm glow of the kitchen light. It didn't look like a dress anymore. It looked like a symbol of everything she had believed about love, family, and the roles she was supposed to play. For the first time, Eleanor realized that her mother had seen that dress as something else entirely, a prison disguised as a dream. She wondered if her mother had stitched that note into the hem on the very night before the wedding. Had she sat at the kitchen table just like this, her fingers moving quickly, her heart full of doubt and fear for her daughter's future? Was she hoping I'd find it before the wedding? The thought sent a chill down her spine. Was it a warning meant for the past or for the future? Her fingers traced the edge of the locket in her palm. It had grown warm from her touch, like it had a heartbeat of its own. She turned it over, brushing her thumb against the face of the man inside. Henry, the man who had loved her mother with a devotion so fierce that it had lived on in letters that no one was supposed to read. She thought of him watching her and Julia from a distance, a man with so much love in his heart that he still wished her happiness, even when it didn't include him. Eleanor let out a slow, shaky breath. Her fingers gripped the locket tighter. He deserved more than that. Mama deserved more, too. Her mind flickered to Julia, her daughter, her only child. Julia, who was just like her. Steady, responsible, practical. But had she taught Julia to be safe like her mother had taught her? Have I passed this burden down too? The realization hit her like a punch to the chest. Her mother had sewn her regrets into that dress, and Eleanor had unknowingly sewn hers into Julia. All the time she told Julia to be smart about her choices. All the time she urged her to focus on stability, to prioritize what was good over what was right. Eleanor had told herself she was being a good mother, giving Julia the wisdom her mother had given her. But was it wisdom, or was it fear disguised as love? Her heart thudded hard in her chest. No more. Not this time. She stood abruptly, pushing the chair back so hard it scraped loudly against the kitchen floor. Her hand shook, but this time it wasn't from doubt. It was from clarity. Her entire life, she had let herself be shaped by someone else's decisions. First her mother's, then Frank's, and finally her own quiet fears. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Her mother had lived her whole life with a secret she never spoke of, a love that could have changed everything. Eleanor didn't want to carry that weight any longer. She picked up the phone from the counter and dialed Julia's number before she could second-guess herself. Her heart pounded as it rang once, then twice. On the third ring, Julia's familiar voice answered, chipper but distracted. "Hey, Mom. Everything okay?" Eleanor swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the locket still in her hand. Her fingers rubbed over it like a talisman, steadying her resolve. "Hey, honey," she said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "Can you come by tonight? I want to talk to you about something. Something important." Julia's voice shifted, her tone becoming alert. "Of course. Is everything all right? You sound a little, I don't know, different." Eleanor let out a soft, breathy laugh that was more of a release than humor. "I am different, sweetheart. Just come, okay?" "Yeah, of course. I'll bring the kids, too." "No," Eleanor said quickly. "Just you. It's something I need to talk to you about. Just us." There was a pause on the other end, but then Julia agreed. They said goodbye, and Eleanor placed the phone back on the counter. Her heart was still racing, but she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Control. She had control now. Her eyes darted back to the letters. Slowly, she gathered them, stacked them neatly, and placed them back in the shoebox. She didn't know if she'd tell Julia about Henry. Not yet. Some truths weren't ready to be spoken aloud, but she would tell her something just as important. Don't live your life for anyone else's expectations. She glanced at the wedding dress again. Her breath caught in her chest. It still felt like it was watching her, like it was waiting for her to make the next move. For a moment, she just stared at it. You're not going back in that box, she thought firmly. You're not hiding anymore. Her hands moved before her mind even realized what she was doing. She walked to the dress, lifted it carefully, and carried it out onto the porch. The cool air hit her skin, and she took a deep breath, the rain-scented air filling her lungs. Her eyes scanned the yard. Her gaze settled on the old fire pit her grandkids had roasted marshmallows over the last summer. Her heart pounded in her chest, faster and faster with every second. Her fingers gripped the dress, tighter this time. Burn it, a voice in her head whispered. No, another voice argued. It's your wedding dress. It's part of your history. But was it? Or had it just been another cage she had willingly walked into? Her mother had sewn her regrets into that dress. Her fears. Her warnings. It had never been about the dress itself. It was about what it represented. She took a deep, steadying breath. Her fingers moved slowly, folding the dress over her arm. Her steps felt heavier than they should have been as she walked toward the fire pit. Every step felt like letting go of something she'd held onto for too long. Her knees cracked as she crouched down, placing the dress inside the stone circle. The lace caught on one of the stones, and for a moment, she hesitated. It's just a dress, Eleanor. But it wasn't just a dress. It was every moment she'd ever chosen to stay quiet instead of speaking up. It was every choice she'd made because she thought it was the right thing to do instead of the true thing to do. Her breath came out in a shaky exhale. She grabbed a pack of matches from the small tin on the porch. Her hands didn't shake this time. She struck the match, the smell of sulfur sharp in her nose, and lowered it to the lace. At first, nothing happened. But then slowly, the lace began to curl, blackening at the edges. The flame caught. It spread quickly, faster than she expected. The ivory silk darkened to brown, then black, then ash. She watched as the fire consumed it all, the hem, the sleeves, the floral lace her mother had sewn with such care. Her mother's hands had built it, and now her hands were unmaking it. Her throat tightened as the flames rose higher, the heat brushing against her face. Her tears returned, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release. Her chest rose and fell in deep, steady breaths. She sat on the ground next to the fire pit, watching as the dress turned to ash. Her heart ached, but it wasn't the kind of ache that lingered. It was the ache of letting something go after carrying it for far too long. She watched every piece of lace disappear into the flames, and with every thread that turned to ash, she felt lighter. The sky was beginning to clear. A soft band of blue peeked out from behind the clouds. Her gaze lifted, following it upward. Maybe, Mama, you and Henry are dancing now. She smiled softly, wiping her cheeks with the sleeve of her sweater. She stayed there, watching until every piece of the dress was gone. Later that night, when Julia arrived, Eleanor would tell her everything. Not just about the dress, not just about her mother, but about the choices women make, the choices they pass down, and the ones they have the power to change. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor knew she had finally chosen for herself. Then,